we are bad motherfuckers. And being bad motherfuckers doesn't mean that we don't deal with this kind of stuff. We don't have triggers that set us off. Being a bad motherfucker is figuring out how to overcome it. Oh, what's going on, everybody? It's day 14. I guess we're officially 2 weeks into the free 30-day challenge for the men inside of Uncaged. And today we're going to be talking about something that's not common when it comes to men specifically, or even just being vulnerable and transparent. So we're going to be talking about triggers. Now, in VIP, we talk about this on the roundtable calls. We've even, had like Chris Burkett from To Be Better podcast come talk to us multiple times. When it comes to Robbie Rapole from Ink Master, come talk about mental health. Shout out, both of them are in VIP. You get access to incredible human beings inside of VIP. No pun intended, but it's 100% a place that you need to be. And if you're not in there now, you need to fucking make a plan to get in there. But we're gonna be talking about triggers, which is emotional traumas, past traumas, all the deep dark things that you've ever been through. There is someone in VIP that's been through it, is going through it, or will go through it. And we openly have these types of conversations. But I want to pour some of the information that we talk about freely inside of VIP with you guys today, which is talking about your triggers and it being your responsibility to understand them. I talked about it in one of the podcasts in a very, very aggressive and polarizing way. Go back and listen to it. I'll drop, whatever the link to that one is in the comment section and description of this video. But guys, it's fucking massive, and it's a real thing, and it's not going anywhere just because you're ignoring it. So now what do? We find a way to deal with it. We find a way to overcome it because we are bad motherfuckers. And being bad motherfuckers doesn't mean that we don't deal with this kind of stuff. We don't have triggers that set us off. Being a bad motherfucker is figuring out how to overcome it. I talked about it very openly. My goal with Heather is not to fight with my wife. That might sound crass to some people, but it's life. You're going to fight. Now, the goal is to fight less and less, but for us, the goal is not to fight. The goal is to not have the same fight twice. And so we had to take a real hard look internally into what set us off, what made us get to a point where we were ready to fight. Because a lot of times, if you look back, there's a trigger and 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 a trigger that led up to the fight. And then if it's real bad and you're both type A personalities like my wife and I, then it's just trigger, 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 trigger during the fight. Because we knew what each other's triggers are, so you're pushing each other's buttons. Now, we've gotten a lot better since we've gone down this journey of understanding our triggers and understanding what upsets us. And now that is your responsibility as a human being, whether you're a single individual, whether you have a wife, whether you have children, because guess what? Your kids are going to set off your triggers. Your employees, your coworkers are going to set off triggers. Your wife, your spouse is going to set off triggers. There's people in day-to-day traffic. You ever heard about I don't even know what it's fucking called. When you're sitting in traffic and someone sets you road rage. A trigger happened that sets you off. And so I've put together a couple of things that we have talked about inside of Uncaged, and honestly, we have not put into implementation until just now. So we're going to be all going through this together collectively as a group, being able to lean on each other and hold each other accountable and have, that homework thread to be able to discuss this openly and brainstorm with each other. But I'm going to go ahead and put these two graphics up and talk about how we overcome these triggers. Now, one of the ones that you're going to see is obviously a trigger journal. What I want you to do is start writing down what is the trigger. So there's going to be something that happens that sets you off. What is it? It could be certain words that your spouse says. It could be certain things that your kid does. It could be the fact that the dog, shit in the floor. It could be the fact that you got an email that you should have got from a client of yours because an employee of yours didn't do what they were supposed to do. What are these triggers? Now let's start to determine, why does it trigger you? Once we determine why it triggers you, we need to figure out what is the first sign that you're being triggered. Like, we want to start, like we talked about earlier, we want to locate the problem as quickly as quickly as possible so that we can move past it as quickly as possible. And then what is going to be the solution to that trigger? So we see something that happens. How do we solve it? Again, we're going to be solution-minded, not problem-minded. Solution focused, not problem focused. So As soon as we see the trigger, we're able to identify it quicker. And how do we solve it faster? But one of the things that I want to break down, and you'll see on the graphic, is your trigger response cycle. First, you have to identify the trigger. Then you have to figure out, why is it a trigger? Then you determine the first sign of the trigger. And then again, lastly, the solution to the trigger. Now, there's two different trigger response goals that we are looking for here, is notice the trigger sooner and get through the trigger faster. So one of the things that we've talked about in many different applications is the story of the bison, right? Most animals, they see a storm coming and they try to run away from the storm. But as the storm comes, it comes over them, it consumes them, and now they are running with the storm, staying in the storm for longer periods of time. Whereas the bison turns and faces the storm, and then they decide to run through the storm, because that way they can get through it quicker. This is what we're looking for here. This is the objective of creating a trigger journal. Now, as a lot of the homework in this 30-day challenge is, it is not meant to be a once and done. Some of this stuff is going to hit you harder than others. Some of these assets are going to be more important to you than some of the previous ones. Whatever it is, these are active, living documents that you update regularly, that you look at regularly, that you pay attention to be what these, see the results that these documents produce. One like this is massively important because you know that it's a trigger, but you have not actively been identifying it as a trigger in the mindset of, how do we come up with a solution to the problem? Because the problem is the triggers for most of these are going to be outside associations. It's going to be things that you can't control. So I can't ask you to control something that you have no control over. But I do have the right and the responsibility as someone in your accountability group to say that it is your responsibility to control how you respond to it. So now this homework is your responsibility to start identifying these triggers in a mindset of saying, all right, we understand that this is causing a problem, but we're not going to be problem focused. We're going to be solution focused. So now my objective is, as I start to notice these triggers, why does it trigger me? This way I get to really internalize what is going on in my life and that is causing me internal. Why would I ever let someone else or an outside influence control me? If you're not in control of yourself, who is? You're allowing your boss, you're allowing your employees, you're allowing your clients, your prospects, your wife, your child, a fucking random person driving down the road to control you. What does that make you? How are we going to be a group of strong, like-minded men if we don't control ourselves? Part of this is these triggers. You fly off the hinges because something happens that regardless you didn't do. No one's just out here purposely causing ourselves pain and turmoil. Typically, it is an outside force that is created. Something happens and we have a reaction to it. It's that reaction, whether it be positive or negative, that is going to determine what the future looks like, whether it be immediate or long-lasting. So if this is a part of our life now, and we control the future by controlling the present, now how do I start to be more vigilant about what happens when outside forces try to come in and cause me frustration? I can't control what these assholes or this economy or this does. I control me, myself, and I, and what I do and how I respond. And if I start responding negatively, off the cuff, shooting from the hip, because I'm not prepared, shame on fucking me. And shame on you if that's you. So now what we are doing is we are creating the cognitive ability to start locating these triggers sooner. And again, a lot of this information stacks on top of itself. When we start to create a new neurocycle, and we'll even back up further to a habit, we start creating these habits of noticing these triggers sooner and getting to the solution quicker, you are now buying back all that time that you spent frustrated and processing and explaining and thinking about the issue. You bought all that time back because you operate differently when you're in a place of scarcity, when you're in a place of not having control, when you're in a place of being outside of your mood, your homeostasis. When you start operating outside of that, albeit you might feel like you're in the trenches, you might feel like you're in the ring, but because you're acting based out of emotions, you're starting to lose grip on the battle. And so it's your responsibility, if you want to be more efficient when it comes to fighting these demons, it's identifying them. I talk about it in VIP all the time. I used to, be an MMA fighter. I loved combat sports. I grew up in combat sports, and there was nothing that made me more fulfilled as a man to know that you could go get locked in a cage with another motherfucker with the sole purpose that one of y'all is getting their hand raised at the end of that. It was an incredible feeling. Won some, lost some. But the concept for me was the study of who that motherfucker is. I would study them. You look at any sports team, you look at any combat athlete, you look at anyone else that has taken their life serious. We actually talked about it very briefly about Justin Gatlin, an Olympic world record holder, or Olympic gold medalist, a world record holder. At one point in time was named the fastest man on the planet for beating Usain Bolt. I know I've already mentioned it, but it bears repeating, right? And I will tell you that the reason he beat Usain Bolt is he started studying him. He got injured, so he controlled the controllables. He had a hairline fracture on his ankle, and so he was put up for a long time recovering. But what he could control was studying the enemy, studying his demons. And he knew that Usain Bolt would take a hit on the 20-meter mark and the 70-meter mark. So he knew what he had to do to outperform him, to beat him at his own game. When he came back, he's been the only one in the World Championship showcase to be able to ever beat Usain Bolt. And he fucking did it. He beat all odds and became one of one in the fucking world because he understood his demons. This is what's happening here, is you're starting to internalize and learn from your own demons. Being triggered fucking sucks. No one likes it. But it's a part of life. And if it's a part of life, guess what? There's no outrunning it. And no pun intended to the Justin Gatlin comment. But you're not going to be able to outrun it. You're not going to be able to hide from it. It's going to happen. So now, as a fucking warrior, as a fucking combat sports veteran, it is your responsibility to study those opponents and see what those triggers are and learn how to be solution focused instead of problem focused when those arise, and learn to be the bison in the situation and turn and go towards the storm so that you can get through it quicker and spend the least amount of time in that situation. Because all the time, let's say the trigger happens over here, and then you have to, because you have not created this trigger journal and you have not learned how to go through the trigger response cycle, you start here and you have to identify the trigger. So something happens outside of your control, and you're spending time figuring out what is the trigger. Why am I upset right now? Because a lot of this stuff could happen subconsciously. Then you have to spend more time and say, why does this trigger me? First, I had to figure out what the trigger is, and then I had to figure out why does it trigger me. So now we're halfway through this process. And then you have to figure out what was the first sign of the trigger. Because if you don't know what it is, when did it even start to become a problem? So now you started to figure out what the first sign of the trigger is. And then you have to go through a problem solution path and figure out what the solution to the trigger is. So now you've spent this amount of time. So we've now wasted this much time. Whereas if we can condense that trigger response cycle because we have a trigger journal and we're constantly adding to it because it's a living document. And oh, that's a new trigger. I need to go write this on my journal. I need to come back at a separate time and do my own internal research into Zack and figure out, why does it trigger me? What previous trauma did I go through that now this is a problem? What was it that's caused a PTSD situation where when this comes out, I freak out and I get defensive? What is all these defense mechanisms that Zack has? And when a trigger happens, I get defensive and I go through this process. And now this trigger response cycle is getting longer and longer and longer. But we start focusing on it and we start to study it and we start to learn from it. And now our trigger time from the trigger happening to us solving the problem is now here, which means all this amount of time we bought back, which we get to start pouring in efficiently to going back to what we were doing prior to the trigger, which was working on building our dream life. So when you don't figure out this right here on the screen, when you don't learn to identify the trigger, when you don't learn why is it a trigger, when you don't learn the first sign of the trigger, and when you don't learn the solution of the trigger, and you are not noticing the trigger sooner, and you are not getting through the trigger faster, you're robbing yourself from that future version of you. That's your fault. That blood is on your hands, and you did it because you weren't fucking prepared. You didn't have this journal figured out. You did not internalize this trigger response cycle. And that's your rights to ignore it. That's totally fine. But when you get to that dream life a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years later, that's your fucking fault. When you get there and you tell your wife, babe, we could have got here a lot sooner, but I was too embarrassed. I had too much of an ego to admit that I had triggers, to admit that I've got past traumas that cause things to happen in my life that I can't 100% explain or describe. That's fine. That's on you. But guess what? You're now in a group of guys that will call you on that bullshit because it is your responsibility. You might not know exactly why it triggers you. You might not know exactly why it bothers you, but you know it does. And now it's your responsibility to go out there and figure you out and learn you so that you don't keep repeating these same cycles over and over. Like I said, my goal with Heather, it ain't to not fight. Just like it ain't my goal to not be triggered. My goal with Heather is to not have the same fight twice, which my goal for my triggers is to recognize them sooner and get through them quicker. That's my goal. I'm going to be triggered. Shit's going to happen. Life will happen. It's my responsibility to control the controllables. It is yours. So please fill this out. Go through the homework. If you have to, this trigger response cycle, save this to the background on your phone. If you're someone that's constantly going through these mental struggles and you need this help to be 24/7 in your face for the next 21 days till you make it a habit, or the next 66 days, 68 days, 69 days until it becomes a new neurocycle for you and you start figuring out this trigger response quicker and quicker and quicker, utilize this. Take the information that you've written out. Write down as much of these triggers that you currently have. Again, it doesn't have to be this document. Create your own document. Put it down in your notes on your iPhone. Write it on a bar napkin. I don't care how you do it. But you need to figure out what is the trigger. You need to figure out why does it trigger you. You need to figure out what was the first sign that you will be triggered by it. And then you need to figure out what is the solution to the trigger. Write that shit down. Submit it into the homework thread. Let's talk about this. Let's work through this together. And I want you to see that there are other men out there that are going through it, will go through it, and have gone through it. And I want you to see that there's other like-minded men around you that are willing to be transparent and vulnerable, because that's where the real growth happens. Thank you so much for hanging out with us 2 weeks into this, and we'll see you tomorrow.